have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello and good evening. This is Don Swans. And for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 1st issue of the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Front page. Really two articles here. The one on top, Why Are My Peers Silent About Iran's Atrocities? It's written by Dina Nayeri. In 7 decades of boldness and risk-taking, my mother's single greatest regret is marching for the 1979 revolution in Iran. She was a 23-year-old medical student, newly married, and pregnant for the first time. When protests broke out to ouster the Shah, she showed up for her community, a tight-knit cluster of graduate students who were frustrated by his extravagance and tyranny. And though she'd spent the 70s in fashionable bell-bottoms and unveiled with a stylish haircut, she put on a chador to support her cohort again, this time for the demonstrations that threw open Iran's doors to the corrupt, murderous Islamic Republic. In the 1960s and 70s, a secular Iran was thriving artistically and culturally. At the Shah's insistence, the country was westernizing and modernizing, an exciting or frightening prospect depending on who you were. But the Shah was a problematic figure, obscene in his displays of wealth and ruthless in his suppression of dissent. He became a symbol of Western decadence, income disparity, immoral living, and kowtowing to Western interests. Though each of Iran's scattered factions wanted something different, they began to unite in their desire to get rid of him. My mother's cluster were moralists, conservative, sheltered children of university-educated parents who believed in God, marriage, and study. They weren't necessarily hijab-wearing conservatives or even Muslims. My mother was Muslim, but her closest friends were Baha'i and Jewish. But they were worried about permissive Western ideas changing Iran. To them, West-toxification meant the end of modesty. Playboys on newsstands, naked women on television. Individuality over community, and the erosion of thousands of years of Iranian culture and morality. Then there were the Marxists, including the Tudeh Party, who wanted to shake off the capitalist Western influences and move toward communism. and an overlapping circle of liberals and intellectuals who wanted to restore the 1906 Constitution with free elections and civil liberties. The oldest of these had witnessed the CIA-backed 1953 coup that overthrew the popular Prime Minister Mossadegh, who had nationalized the oil industry in favor of a more controllable Shah. In the background were ordinary people like my rural-born father, a vast population of along-getters and pleasure-seekers who just wanted to live. They didn't organize or worry too much about cultural change. What angered them was that their families struggled for basic needs, while the Shah fattened himself on the people's oil. Of these culturally Muslim, rural working class, often credited with wanting a theocracy, my mother says they just wanted someone to give them their rights. The only thing that united them was basic human needs. One faction that did want a theocracy were the radical Islamists, who, with their unkempt beards and disdain for music and art, looked and behaved very little like most of 1970s Iran. Their leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, was exiled in France and shrouded in mystery. Nowadays, my mother says, a Google search can tell you more in a minute about Ayatollah Khomeini's ideology than the entire population knew at the time. So how did the clerics hijack the people's revolution from everyone else? I know it sounds strange to say that the revolution wasn't about Islam, that the Iranian people were then, as they are now, religiously diverse, largely secular, and with an ancient artistic intellectual heritage rooted in Zoroastrianism. If I had to describe every Iranian in one blanket cultural statement, I'd say an Iranian is a melodramatic poet biologically incapable of walking away from food, music, or a party. To these ordinary kinfolks, the Ayatollah Khomeini made sweeping promises that the poor, religious minorities, and women would be better off under his rule. He even claimed in interviews and speeches that women would have more rights than men. The clerics then convinced the desperate political factions that to achieve this utopia, they would need to categorize themselves under a single ideology: out with the Shah and his Western alliances. Iranian resources would be for Iranians. But for the revolution to work and these shared economic goals to materialize, everyone would have to accept the entire ideological package. So when the Ayatollah called women delicate flowers that must be protected from male concerns, my mother and her friends ignored their distaste, and they ignored warnings from their parents and professors too. You are either in or you are out. And if you are out, you are siding with Western imperialists. The tactic worked. The Shah boarded a plane, scooping a fistful of Iranian dirt on his way out. The Ayatollah Khomeini, the cleric who had promised everything to everyone, arrived on a Western jet from Paris. We should have known, my mother says, because what exile returns on a fancy jet from France? Immediately upon gaining power, the Islamic Republic murdered the leaders of the factions who have paved its way, publishing gory photos of their deaths in national magazines. And barely 2 years into the new regime, my mother and her friends were mourning their blind involvement. It was a mistake, my mother says. We didn't want a religious government. They promised us something else, she adds, warning. If a group ever asks you to agree with them on everything, it's a cult. The cultish dynamic would come up again throughout my life as I moved from Oklahoma to university and beyond. In each new community, my friends and colleagues clustered around a few core beliefs and accepted everything that felt roughly aligned with those values, relying on their community to arbitrate an array of issues for them. Now, in 2026, the Islamic Republic is benefiting from this tendency, quashing the People's Revolution, just as it did in 1979. When I was 10 years old, my mother, now an outspoken Christian convert, was granted U.S. asylum and sent to Oklahoma, with me and my brother in tow. We joined a Christian community where we were often asked to share our story in local churches. We spoke about how Jesus had chosen us, rescued us, the dangers we'd escaped. We left out the parts that didn't fit the immigrant narrative, that we missed Iran, that the Muslims we knew were not militant, that our culture was ancient, rich, and varied. Nobody seemed as interested in those. Growing up in the Bible Belt, I took great solace in promises of God's protection, His plans for my life. But as I entered my teenage years, I started to deviate from certain aspects of the faith. I felt constantly at war with my new community's teachings about women, gender, and marriage, that men were the head of the family, that women should submit to their husbands. But when I spoke up, our church leaders insisted that you can't pick and choose from the Bible, that the Word of God is not a handbook of suggestions, and that cherry-picking your beliefs make you a Christian in name only. Eventually, I left for university, where I found my own tribe of bookish girls. I experimented with my versions of myself, and slowly I found my voice as a liberal woman, and later as a writer and advocate for refugees. By my 30s, I was comfortably situated in yet another trusted cohort, supporting my activist friends on things we all cared about: reproductive rights, wrongful convictions, freedom for Palestine. But I couldn't research everything I believe that we all cared about the same things: climate stability, freedom, safety, justice, basic human rights, and dignity for everyone. So if the group planted a flag on a faraway issue, I could probably go with it. At no time did it occur to me that this was the precise behavior I had judged in the 70s Iranian activists and 90s Southern evangelicals. I first noticed a shift in the progressive reaction to Iran in the late 2010s. Between 2017 and 2020, I published several essays and a memoir about my mother's imprisonment and our escape from the Islamic Republic and the displacement that followed. I received hundreds of messages from readers, some I expected, anti-immigrant rants, of course, and support from allies and fellow immigrants. But there was a confusing third category that seemed to come from otherwise liberal native-born Americans. The discourse around Islamophobia had swelled and become dangerously binary. In the wake of the Muslim ban, and now I heard comments like, well, it's a Muslim country, and your mother broke the law. Again and again, I encountered the casual claim that a majority of Iranians wanted to live under Sharia law, and that my criticism of repressive laws like forcible hijab equals religious bigotry. American women allowed themselves to say this to me, an Iranian who spent 3 years under forced hijab in an Islamic Republic school. One academic asked me flat out if I loved Iran so much, why was I bad-mouthing it? In a single flippant remark, she confused Iran with the Islamic Republic. Very different. My memoir with rhetoric, I was just telling my story, forced migration and disloyalty. We were forced to leave, and a hatred of murderers with hatred of the country and faith they hijacked. I dismissed these misguided reactions and the silly underlying implication that any criticism of a cleric regime puts all Muslims in an unflattering light. But in 2022, when the morality police killed 22-year-old Masha Amini for refusing to wear a hijab, and the Woman Life Party protests kicked off, the support from my cohort felt even more tepid and reluctant. Later in fall 2023, after the October 7 attacks, that support dried up. Since then, every reputable newspaper has documented and authenticated photos and videos of the regime's atrocities. Hundreds of protesters, including children, have been killed. Thousands imprisoned and tortured since 2022. Dozens executed after sham trials. The European Union has designated Iran's Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. Amid all this, Western-educated Iranians, like me, are still hearing some of our peers, otherwise well-informed humanitarian writers, and the Shah's parroting Islamic Republican talking points, that the diaspora is ill-informed, fear-mongering, manipulated by Trump or Israel or racist, imperialist right-wing forces. And now this dismissive attitude has spread to the general public as part of a progressive belief package. From Huda Katan of Huda Beauty, who posted a video of a pro-regime rally, and after viral backlash from Iranian customers called the post a mistake. To protesters flying the Islamic Republic flag, not the historic national lion and sun flag, alongside Palestine's. More and more human rights experts, lawyers, even some celebrities, are joining Iranians in condemning the lazy rhetoric that sustains Iran's dictators. In June 2025, in response to a photo of a white protester waving Islamic Republic propaganda, actress Nazanian Buniati posted, "Well-meaning but misguided progressives in the West have swallowed the Islamic Republic's propaganda. Millions of Iranians would trade places with you in a heartbeat, while you defend their oppressors." And yet, the groundswell of outrage that I expected from my community has not materialized. Iranians are dying in the streets, but even outspoken public figures like Greta Thunberg, who openly support a free Palestine and women's rights, both aims that align with a free Iran, and who have received themselves and who have themselves enjoyed Western freedom, are still silent on Iran. Where are the protests on college campuses? The social media campaigns? The problem is that the issue has been miscast. When I started posting videos on Instagram supporting the latest uprisings in Iran, my feed began to veer right on a range of unrelated issues. Why would the algorithm think I'd agree with such much of this nonsense? Except that my views on Iran have been categorized alongside them. Today, in 2026, the Islamic Republic is using the same old tactic to confuse and override the people's will. It wants you to look away from its crimes, and so it has shrewdly attached itself to the victims in Gaza. Just like in 1979, when the clerics convinced everyone to band together on some general anti-Western vibe. They are now benefiting from people's impulses to rally around general anti-racism vibes. Sure, state-sanctioned mass murder is bad, but who wants to be mistaken for an imperialist or and Islamophobe. As a woman who spent her first 8 years trembling under the regime's eye, berated by teachers and made to chant hateful slogans in the schoolyard, I'm baffled by this moral inconsistency. We are rightfully outraged by the brutality of ICE, but Iran's morality police have brutalized citizens in even worse ways for nearly half a century. We're disgusted by the Epstein files, but in Iran, girls as young as 9 are forced to marry older men. There's no need for secret files. And the Islamic Republic has shot, hanged, or otherwise murdered thousands of innocents, including minors. Since December, I feel the old loneliness returning. I am American and Iranian, a progressive feminist, a humanitarian. I believe in liberal values. I'm also trying to form opinions more thoughtfully, and here's where I've landed. I find it racist to believe that while you're sophisticated enough to need democracy, Iranians are not. We all want the same thing: our share of our land's resources, a voice in governance, and the freedom to thrive according to our nature. Nobody, Muslim or Christian, Baha'i or atheist, wants to be stuck under the crushing rule of somebody else's God. And I get it. We can't expect everyone to research every issue or mobilize for every fight. Often we decide at the outset, I'm humanitarian or I'm a conservative Christian, and we accept our group's handbook assuming that each opinion has been vetted by experts and that it will be generally right most of the time. But sometimes our communities get it wrong. Humanitarians might miss an atrocity. Feminists might overlook sexism. We make compromises and alliances and mistakes, and that's okay. But it takes intellectual humility, curiosity, and bravery to correct those mistakes and to stray from the herd toward a messy and complicated truth. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Here's a totally different type of story. It's short. It's by Emma Rosenbaum, and its title is, "What's All the Fuss About Bone Density?" Like many of my peers, I'm being bombarded with hectoring advice about my skeletal health. What's a 40-something woman to do? A couple of months ago, I was out to dinner with my sister when she turned to me with a serious look. "Emma, I'm worried about something," she said wearily, eyeing my pasta bolognese. She paused long enough for my mind to go to a dark place. Our parents. One of the kids. It's your bones," she said dryly. I'm worried about your bone density. As far as I know, my bones are fine. In fact, the only bone I've ever broken is my thumb in 10th grade when a friend kicked a soccer ball into my hand at close range. Since then, my bones have done their job without a hitch. My sister reminded me that I have small wrists. And since I'm generally a lazy bum who doesn't exercise much, I should be thinking more about bone density. Plus, she's noticed that I don't eat enough protein. After I pointed out that bolognese is meat, she directed me to Instagram dietitians for advice about protein intake. I played dumb just to annoy her. That's what sisters do. But of course, as a 40-something woman, I was already well aware of the stranglehold such topics have on my peer group. We're currently living through an explosion of interest bordering on obsession in perimenopausal and menopausal wellness. Protein, weighted vests, heavy lifting, more protein. I have friends who choke down Greek yogurt by a bucketful, who eat handfuls of grilled chicken at a time, who deadlift their own body weight. Google searches for bone density hit an all-time high this summer, which is around when I started seeing the term pop up on my Instagram feed. Admittedly, we are a generation attempting to age differently than our brittle-boned mothers and grandmothers. But my real and digital lives are now filled with women explaining in excruciating detail what I should do to strengthen my skeleton. Did you know that jumping is very effective in building bone density? Should I hop around New York City like a kangaroo in a weighted vest? One of my mom group chats recently turned to strength training, and I copped to finally succumbing to peer pressure and buying weights on Amazon. 5-pounders to be exact. You have to start somewhere, right? But instead of being applauded for my effort, I was roundly shamed by my friends. Throw them out, wrote one. Definitely doesn't count, wrote another. A petite woman who said she lifts up to 50 pounds every day said heavy lifting is much more effective than weighted vests. She continued, I love her, but my friend is neither a medical professional nor a fitness coach. For guidance, I consult with Dr. Karen Tang, the author of It's Not Hysteria, Everything You Need to Know About Your Reproductive Health, but we're never told, who offers a more measured take. Bone density is a real medical concern, she says. As women age and produce less estrogen, bone mass decreases, which can lead to osteopenia, thinning of the bones, and is more serious cousin, osteoporosis, which comes with a high risk of fracture. For too long, a woman going into perimenopause and menopause just drifted along, suffering through symptoms. Eventually, maybe, they found out they had frail bones and were put on medicines, said Dr. Tang. The increased awareness around this is good because some of it is preventable. But there's so much information it can become a source of stress. Recently, there's been chatter about DEXA, D-E-X-A scans, an X-ray test that measures bone density, recommended for women over 65 or over 50 if you have risk factors. I've watched cheerful "come with me to get a DEXA scan" videos on Instagram, followed by 20-somethings dissecting their results. None of these women were anywhere near 65, but who knows, maybe a few of them learned that their bones need help. The ultimate trendsetter, Gwyneth Paltrow, was diagnosed with osteopenia in 2010 at age 37, and she's still on the front lines of the issue. Last month, she joked with Amy Poehler on her podcast that she will gag down protein 70 times a day, a commitment I'm not willing to make. So what should I do? I asked Dr. Tang if I have to deadlift my own weight, hop around the block, or get a DEXA scan, and she laughs and says no. If you're not at high risk, you don't have to do any of that. For the average person, it's just lifestyle modifications, some weight-bearing exercises, some strength training. Dr. Tang also looked into the studies about weighted vests. Maybe if you wear one for 8 hours a day, it might help a little bit. But who's going to do that, she says. To be fair, she hasn't met my crazy friends. So I won't buy a jump rope. I won't take creatine. Instead, I'll go about my life as before, carrying my groceries home, using my 5-pound Amazon weights, and eating pasta bolognese. Even so, my sister has already suggested I buy a vibrating plate. Apparently they're great for building bone mass. A middle-aged influencer told her so. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. That other article from the first page is entitled, "What is a City When Its Wealthiest Leave?" It's written by Richard Florida. Google co-founder Larry Page recently made headlines by spending $188 million on 3 Miami mansions. He's not the only billionaire looking at a big move. His Google co-founder Sergey Brin is reportedly shopping for Miami property. So is WhatsApp co-founder Jan Koum. The shopping spree comes as California considers a wealth tax to impose a one-time retroactive levy on billionaires that has fueled speculation that they've had it with the Golden State. In New York City, where Mayor Zoran Mandani earlier this month proposed an increase in taxes on high-income people, and short of that, a property tax increase. There is talk of a parallel exodus. The wealthy have long threatened to leave when battling local government over taxes. In the past, they rarely did. But their threats have teeth this time. Not because they're abandoning great cities, but because they have figured out they don't have to. Now that digital technology allows them to separate where they live and pay taxes from where their businesses operate, they aren't relocating their companies, they're relocating themselves. This upends the basic arrangement that underwrote great cities: what they are, how they work, and who pays for them. Amid this seismic shift looms an existential question. Can those cities survive without them? For most of history, people lived where they worked. On the farm, above the shop, close to the factory. Suburbanization expanded the radius, but workers, managers, and executives still had to be close to where jobs concentrated. Because people had to be there. Cities could charge a premium. Residents paid it in housing costs, in taxes, and in the costs of commuting or other frictions of day-to-day life. The alternative, living elsewhere, meant being cut off from their livelihoods and economic opportunity. Taxes were part of that price, and people paid because they had no choice. When COVID hit, this social compact appeared to quake. A chorus of commentators predicted the imminent collapse of New York, London, San Francisco, and other great global cities. They predicted the wealthy and their companies would be driven out by lockdowns, governance failures, crime, and the sudden possibility of remote work. The cities, as a result, would hollow out. There seemed to be something to this at first. Ken Griffin located himself and the headquarters of his Citadel hedge fund from Chicago to Miami. The venture capitalists, Peter Thiel and Keith Rabois, bought homes on Miami Beach and opened an office for their venture capital fund in Miami, too. Jeff Bezos moved from Seattle to Miami, assembling a $200 million plus compound. But the predicted total exodus never fully materialized. Many of the billionaires and professionals who moved to Miami quickly came face to face with its limits. Public and private schools couldn't match what they had left behind. Housing costs rose astronomically, making Miami now one of the most unaffordable markets in the country. Most critically, they found it hard to recruit top talent. New York and London remained the centers of global finance. San Francisco remained the center for high technology, with the lions share of venture capital investment to AI startups still flowing into the Bay Area. In 2023, Thiel admitted as much, conceding that the tech industry remained densely concentrated in California and that Miami's housing cost had put the city out of reach for much of the talent he needed, making it harder to move companies and their people than he initially thought. Griffin himself ended up building a massive new building in New York, even as Citadel expanded in Miami. But eventually, they realized they didn't have to move their companies at all. Digital technology enabled them to live in one place and keep their business in another. That could establish residency in Miami, which requires no particular time spent there to claim residency status, and spend much of the year wherever else they wanted, flying into New York or San Francisco for whatever mattered. The city where their businesses are headquartered became just that, not somewhere they needed to reside and pay taxes. That has transformed the underlying economic logic of cities. They are no longer self-contained economic units. Digital technology is remaking them into networks, physical places connected by virtual ties and dynamic talent flows. Economic participation now happens across places, not within them. My own research has documented the rise of what I call lifestyle tax havens. Cities such as Miami, Dubai, and Singapore that combine low or no income taxes with warm weather, luxury amenities, and easy access to global networks. These lifestyle tax havens do not replace the great hubs. They're satellites in their orbit, part of the networks that form around them. Miami is a critical node in New York's financial network. Austin operates as a satellite of San Francisco's tech network. Dubai plays a similar role for London and the financial centers of Europe and Asia. Billionaires make headlines, but the same math applies down the economic ladder. For a high earner, a move from San Francisco, Los Angeles, or New York to Miami could save 10 to 14 percentage points on income tax based on current rates. For a professional couple earning $1 million a year, that's roughly $100,000 to $140,000 annually, adding up to more than $1 million over a decade. This is a simplification, of course. Certainly, taxes can be complicated by write-offs and different income types, but the income tax rates paint a clear picture. What becomes of cities that are lifestyle tax havens? They were never built to scale in the way older cities have. In the old urban system, people were anchored to place. That anchoring did more than generate tax revenue. It created loyalty, civic investment, and philanthropy. The long-term commitment that built private schools, museums, hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. When people stayed, they fixed what was broken because they had no alternative. The lifestyle tax havens have often lacked the civic commitment that allowed places like New York, London, Paris, or Chicago to grow into fuller spectrum cities. Places like Miami lack the integrated infrastructure and public systems such as population and activity increase. Every day, urban functions become harder to manage. Moving around becomes increasingly difficult. Housing costs rise rapidly. Schools and public services struggle to keep pace. These are not temporary growing pains. They are structural limits. The model works well enough for wealthy residents who can buy private solutions: housing, education, transportation, security. For empty nesters and young professionals without children, the trade-offs may be manageable. For families, they are far more consequential. And for service workers, the people who staff hospitals, schools, restaurants, and local government, the barriers are often insurmountable. When the people who make a city run cannot afford to live there, the city itself begins to fray. This is the dynamic the economist Albert Hirschman warned about. That loyalty is what turns frustration into voice. The impulse to fix what is broken rather than flee. Today, exit is cheap and reversible. When taxes rise or services disappoint, the response is no longer to press for reform, but to move. Cities then are pushed toward a race to the bottom, not one driven by ideology, but by mobility. As high earners leave the tax base without leaving the economy, cities face pressure to lower taxes without lowering obligations. The burden of funding schools, transit, parks, public safety shifts to those who remain. Established cities and rising stars alike are caught in this trap. Cities cannot simply chase mobile residents by cutting taxes. That's a losing game. National governments are unlikely to solve this problem. And in any case, it plays out at a global scale. Cities will have to respond on their own by rethinking what they tax. If income and wealth can move, cities must focus on what cannot: land and prosperity, consumption and entertainment, visitor and tourism, commuters and employment, companies that operate locally, and anchor institutions that are rooted in place. For decades, great cities benefited from a relatively captive tax base. That constraint has now weakened, and in many cases, it has been broken. Cities can respond to this new competition, or they can choose not to. But they cannot opt out. As I said, Richard Florida wrote this article, and he's a distinguished visiting professor at Vanderbilt University, a university professor at the University of Toronto, and a distinguished fellow at the Kresge Foundation. He is the author of The Rise of the Creative Class, and the New Urban Crisis, and is currently writing a book on how digital technology is reshaping cities and the geography of work. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. On January 17th of this year, a lady by the name of Gladys West died. She was 95, close to being 96. As a kid, she didn't like algebra, but said that geometry was something that came naturally to her. And so it did. And she spent 42 years with the United States Navy as a civilian employee, with all of her research being devoted to the creation of the Global Positioning System, or GPS, a priority for the U.S. military. As I said, she didn't like algebra, but geometry was something that came natural. A remarkable woman who just kept working at it for a 42-year career. Seeking a better job, she applied to the Navy Research Center in Dahlgren. After she was invited for an interview, that she began having doubts that Dahlgren was so small she couldn't find it on a map. It might be hard to find a place to live in still segregated Virginia, she felt. And did they realize that she was black? She turned down the interview. A few weeks later came astonishing news. She had been given the job without an interview. It turned out that managers of the research facility were opening their doors to black employees. A year earlier, President Eisenhower had issued an executive order mandating equal opportunity for all citizens in federal offices. In any event, she worked hard her entire life and is no longer with us. But she should be recognized. Thank you, Gladys West. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 1st issue of the Wall Street Journal Review. We read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday this evening at 7 p.m. Your reader has been Don Swans, and we thank you. We thank you for listening. Hope to see you here on the same place, at the same place, on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service dial. Good night now, and thanks for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the New York Times. Following that, at 9 o'clock is Fortune Magazine, and at 10 o'clock is episode number 8 of The Correspondent by by Virginia Evans. Stay with us for these readings and more. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability.